If you've ever had generational friction in the workforce, this episode is for you. We are digging into all the generational trends that you'll see in the workplace. What motivates a Gen Z versus a millennial versus a Gen Xer? And what is it that we really want? We're also going to be talking about communication preferences across different generations and some of those kind of assumptions or generalizations or stereotypes we make about different generations and unpacking those myths. I'm joined by my good friend Ashley Fell, who is a social researcher and speaker. She is also a work futurist and she is an absolute legend of a human. She's joining me on the pod today. Let's go. This is a podcast about making work work. You'll learn about leadership, career growth, and how to navigate those weird work challenges. I run a HR consulting business called Boldside, where I help leaders build epic team cultures. If you lead a team or run a business and you think I can help, let's connect on LinkedIn. My name is Shelley Johnson, and this is Work. Ashley Fell, thank you for coming to the pod today.
My pleasure. So excited to be here.
Okay, so I think it was 6 years ago we did a podcast.
I know. Where has that time gone?
Where has it gone? We were baby podcasters, and it was when it was me and Embo, and you joined, and you just released a book.
Yep.
Was it Work Wellbeing?
Work Wellbeing, yeah, book one.
Which I've quoted so many times over my life.
So lovely.
It is a very good book. But hey, we're going to get into it today, and I have multiple questions here. I'm looking at my sheet. I've got so many pieces of paper in front of me. Okay, so we're talking about, I was going to frame this as generational drama at work.
Love that.
But you know what? Like, so many questions we get around, because a lot of the people we work with at Boldside are leaders in organisations. They might be millennial, they might be Gen Xers, and they're like, how do I motivate Gen Z?
Yeah.
And first of all, this is completely unrelated to where I was going, but just as a question, is it Gen Z or Gen Z?
Oh my gosh, I say Z.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I feel like Z is a bit American, but anything is acceptable.
Okay, so let me tell you why I say that.
Okay.
I was doing a workshop once with a whole bunch of Gen Zs.
Yep.
And I was like, yeah, so blah, 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 something Gen Zs. And they were like, it's Gen Z.
Because they're probably listening to all the TikToks about themselves produced by American influencers or something.
Well, then I was like, but in Australia we say Z.
Yeah.
Like Z. Anyway, so that's just a first question, but we're both millennials, so how would we know?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. We're like,
how would we know? You would know because you're a social researcher in this space, so you do actually know. I just need to say that from the outset. Okay, let's just get into this straight away. What are you seeing as some of the big generational shifts that we're seeing in the workforce at the moment?
I think the biggest one at the moment is we have more generations in the workforce than ever before. And there's a few reasons for that. People are living longer, so they're working later. So you've got more baby boomers staying in leadership roles, or maybe not even in leadership roles, but just in the workplace. And secondly, like the alphas, who everyone thinks are like 5 and 6, and they are, but the oldest is 16. And so they'll be entering the workforce in the immediate future, in the next couple of years, like whether they're serving us at Macca's or, moving into part-time employment. So that generational change piece is always evolving. And we often describe it as one of those kind of tides. It's the idea that it's not a wave, it's not AI, it's not this new and exciting thing, but it is changing and it's this long-term piece, and people kind of don't really notice. But then when you're trying to work with someone who has been shaped in a completely different era to you with a different context, raised on different music, different values, you go, oh, there's a bit of friction going on here.
It's really, even you just saying Gen Alpha are not 5 and 6, because I've obviously got a 4 and an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
And so I think of them as like tiny little people.
Yeah.
And then as I'm thinking like, oh yeah, like if there's someone doing work on your house and they've got an apprentice, they're a Gen Alpha.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And even for Gen Z, Gen Z.
Now you're
me questioning myself. Yeah, that's right.
Overthink that on the drive home to Sydney.
Having a crisis. No, that's okay. In terms of the alphas, like they are, and I also, by the way, I had to say like 6, 7. I was like, don't say 6, 7. Don't use it accidentally. But they are young, but the oldest are interesting to think about. And even with the Gen Zs, like the youngest are in school still, but the oldest are 30. 30.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so like they're having kids of their own if they're having them at a bit of a younger age than the average. And they could be moving into leadership roles in the workplace. I mean, anyone in their 20s today is Gen Z. So again, like thinking just about even the people who are on the cusp and where the generation begins and ends versus like where in our minds they sit, I think that's also interesting.
Can I just say something about people being on the cusp of a generation?
You sure
I always
can.
feel sorry for these people.
Okay.
Because you're like, okay, we need to unpack this more. Because, one of my good friends who I would label as a geriatric millennial.
Yeah.
So they're like, what would a geriatric millennial be in age-wise? Because I'm 25 in my mind.
Yeah.
I've never aged beyond 25, which I'm definitely much older than that. But like, I guess they're in their early 40s.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
And so they're on the cusp. They kind of like have Gen X views on life, but they're still kind of in the millennial category.
Yep.
And then the same with the really young millennials who are, 32 maybe?
Yeah.
31?
Yep.
I always feel sorry for the people on the cusp because
Well,
they're kind of like, I don't know.
I am just a couple of years older than the youngest age you mentioned. And I'm on the cusp. I can relate to them all, but then I'll speak to my Gen Z colleagues and they're like, oh, Ash, like you're
out of
so
touch.
lame. And I'm like, oh, okay, yep, no worries, that's fine. So it's humbling for sure. And even like the Gen Z who are the older end of their generation and I'm on the younger end of the millennials, I'm thinking there's only 5 years between us, but sometimes it's so stark, the difference. Like it's crazy.
Difference.
Yeah.
So I'm one of 5 kids and I am the second oldest and my brother would be Gen Z.
Yeah.
And like the difference between us, so how many, I don't even know, like I'm so bad at maths. I think there's 8 years between us.
Yeah.
The difference between us, just how we see the world, but also like how we see work.
Yeah.
Him and I are so different. And like even my youngest sister, Mill, like we're so different too. And I'm like, it's a generational difference between us. Like that's all I can explain. It's not, I'm like, I don't boil it down to personality at all. I'm like, no, you're just from a different generation to me.
Yeah.
But let's talk about those like shifts. When you think about so many generations in the workforce,
Yeah.
what are the tension points that you see and then what are the advantages?
I think from the research that I have seen and analysed, a lot of the tension points do come down to motivation, why you work, why you would choose a particular employer, for example. Communication styles is another big one that we've seen. And also I would say work ethic or expectations of work ethic or perceptions of work ethic in terms of, and even loyalty and how you view loyalty and job turnover. Like we know that younger generations are moving jobs more frequently. Our prediction is that they'll have 18 jobs across 6 careers in their lifetime.
Okay.
Which is very career mobile. And again, for me, like I have been in a workplace where I hit 10 years and hit long service, but that's so rare for young people today. And so even that expectation of why you would change for a job and then compare that, like we're just comparing right now in my own story, a millennial to a Gen Z, for example, but then compare a baby boomer to a Gen Z. And, you know, they're thinking, wow, like, of course you'd stay for 10 years. Of course you'd work out that tenure and get the job opportunities, whereas younger generations are going, oh, I'm changing jobs every 3 years because of new opportunities, and in the past as well, I think what I saw and what I've seen is when people change jobs historically, you'd be like, oh, what happened? Like, what's the tea?
Yeah.
What's the goss? Like, what went wrong? And young people today going, oh, I loved it. I just wanted to change. And so even that like idea of change and how used to it they are, I think that's quite different to older generations. One other thing I'll say about the workplace and just life in general is also technology. Like it's changing everything. AI is changing everything, future of work, how we work, and even just that openness to AI and technology is also really different across the generations in terms of how their perspective, their attitude, their sentiment towards it, but also their openness to actually experimenting with it. So there's some challenges, but also I guess you can frame all of those, especially that last one, as an opportunity where you go, okay, well if you're someone older going, AI like freaks me out. I just want to put my head in the sand and not deal with it. If you've got someone on your team who is younger and open open to kind of failing fast and moving forward and experimenting, who can upskill everyone else, like hopefully you can then utilize their own openness to technology for your organization's benefit. So yeah, there's lots of challenges, but they can be framed as opportunities too, I think.
So I want to dig into this a little bit more around what are the tension points and how can we understand some of the higher level motivations, communication styles and work ethic perceptions or trends that we see. I love the language of career mobile, and like I'm just thinking about you're an outlier actually, as you were saying, like you've hit long service leave. I'm like, I have always wanted to hit long service leave. I haven't ever. Yeah. And I also think I'm like the Long Service Leave Act should change to 5 years.
It absolutely should.
Because no one's staying in workplaces that long, but that's an aside.
Yeah. No one says me who just, has. But I'm an outlier
you're
for sure.
You're an outlier.
Yeah.
Especially for our age group. Yeah. But I just want to ask about this idea of those 3 domains, motivation. I'm looking at my notes as I'm talking. That's why motivation, communication styles. And I think it was a great pickup there around work ethic or perception of work ethic. Mm-hmm. Can you let's start with motivation. What are some of the core differentiators that you found in your research when it comes to the motivations we would see at different, in the different generations?
The big one that gets talked a lot about with Gen Z is purpose, how purpose-driven they are. And I see that as well in the research. And then a part of me, the devil's advocate part in my mind goes, but isn't everyone motivated by purpose? We all want to work for an organisation where we feel connected to the purpose, where we feel like our work is having purpose. But I guess it's much more heightened for Gen Z. So that's the big one. But the other thing I think about with motivation was from a study that I saw, which was so fascinating. And it looked at what, I guess, attracts or motivates someone to apply for a new role. Like what are they looking for in a new place of employment? And it was really different. Every generation had a really different kind of order of what they look for. So Gen Z, the top was career progression.
Okay.
For millennials, flexibility. For Gen X, remuneration, they just said, look, we just want to be paid well. And I'm like, that's your prerogative. I mean, we want to be paid well, but that ranked highest for Gen X.
Okay.
And baby boomers was convenient location. And so it was just so interesting because sometimes when you see studies that are run and you go to look at the generational differences, sometimes there's actually none. Another example of a similar study was what kind of qualities do you value most in the workplace? Every generation said trust as number one.
Wow.
So that was a key similarity. There wasn't a difference. But for this question around motivation and new workplace, every single generation had a different priority, which I think was interesting. And then when I often talk about that, people ask me, okay, well, what's characteristic of a generation compared to what's characteristic of a life stage? And I think that's a really interesting question as well to unpack.
That is so good.
Yeah. So what will the generation carry through with them because it's a generational characteristic versus what will change because of the life stage they're in. So it'd be interesting. I mean, it'd be great to have that study run,
longitudinally.
Longitudinally, exactly. But we could have compared and gone, okay, well, baby boomers, when they were in their 20s, did they also rank career progression as number one? That would be an interesting question. But then there's so much to think about in terms of like the economic context, the macro, external trends, the job market, like that all plays an impact, I think, on survey results and insights. But the generational piece, I think is interesting. And my answer to that question is a bit of a cop-out. I always say it's aspects of both, of course. I think it's aspects of, generational, but also life stage. And this one particular, like with the flexibility, for example, the millennials, as much as I miss the days when millennial meant young person, it doesn't mean that anymore. And the Gen Zs came out in force a few years ago and said, stop grouping us with the millennials, like we're the young ones. Do you remember that?
It was like, and they really didn't want to be associated with us. Like, but we're really cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Like we are also very cool.
Like,
and then
just
you're
like us.
actually, if you have to ever say that out loud, you're absolutely not.
It's a telltale sign.
It's just very Mean Girls. I get the vibe of Mean Girls there. Yeah, keep going.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, I know. I get that. But I think with the millennials, we are in our 30s and 40s. We are having kids. We are like the largest generation in the workforce. We are the generation who've been locked out of the housing market because of our love of Smash Davo and all of that. Like there's a lot of competing pressures. So it makes sense to me then that the millennials are saying flexibility tops the list. Even then you might go, oh, I'm surprised that it didn't top the list for Gen Z, because a lot of the stereotypes or the conversation is they want flexibility, and they do, but I think the millennial life stage at the moment is driving that because they've got competing demands, kids to pick up, all those things that the Gen Zs maybe don't have at that life stage. So, yeah, that was really interesting in terms of the motivations.
Because certainly the rhetoric around Gen Z would be, what I would have suspected if you were to present this, I would have thought flexibility, work from home, all the stuff we hear about in the media, touted about what young people want at work versus this career progression idea, which is really interesting because, I'm a really big believer in working from home and working flexibly. Boldside, my business, we're fully remote. We don't have an office. And I think people should be able to work flexibly and have clear goals, and we work towards those. However, it's really interesting just thinking this through, and I'm looking at these motivators going, career progression, one of the best ways I think you can progress in your career is learning by osmosis, which is sitting next to someone, sometimes in an office, learning. And as much as I'm no, I love working from home, and I personally would not want to go back to an office full-time by any means, I can see why career progression happens more naturally when you're in proximity to people.
Totally.
Now, there's heaps of downsides into just being presenteeism, and you don't we think if I see someone, they must be productive, which we know is a complete farce. But I'm just thinking that out loud, going, how Gen Z find that community that help with progression. I know you've looked into and done some research on I guess thinking about that return to the office. We've seen lots of organisations mandate return to the office 5 days, which to me is pretty wild. But what are your thoughts on that as you overlay this idea of Gen Z wanting career progression and then the return to the office dynamic?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier the Work Wellbeing book, which was a throwback.
It is, but it's so good.
And it's funny because that book was written pre-COVID. And we had this big delay with the publisher, and I was so angry at the time. But then I was so thankful because we were due to publish it before the pandemic hit. And I was so thankful we didn't publish a book about work before the pandemic came in and kind of changed everything. So we ended up being able to review the manuscript and published it after. But we looked in that book a lot about why do we work? And work is more than remuneration, and work is more than kind of exchange of time and money. It's community, it's purpose. It is for some people, and I would say for many Gen Zs, their place of connection and belonging outside of, run clubs and things like that.
Yeah.
The rise of the run club. They are expanding and looking outside of that, which is good. Because I think we are seeing just more broadly in society breakdown of people not going to church as much, or those traditional forms of community and connection and belonging, getting a tribe. It's a bit harder to find that these days, adding in, of course, then the fact that Gen Z are, spending a lot of time on social media and that illusion of community. The other thing that's really interesting, we've seen a lot in the research, is loneliness in Gen Z.
Wow.
They're feeling and you would expect in the studies that it would be older generations who maybe are living alone to be the ones who would exhibit more of that, but it's actually Gen Z who are the loneliest generation in the stats, which is really sad and really not terrifying, but anyway, so
Can I ask just on that, what do you think contributes to that loneliness?
I think it is look, it's hard to say. It's social media and it's technology, but I do think there is that illusion of, I'm in a community online, but I don't think it's the same as the in-person kind of community. The other statistic that's quite compelling around this is that 57% of Gen Z wish social media had never been created.
Whoa.
Yeah, which is really interesting to think about then, social media for the generation to come after them and all the benefits, but also all the challenges and the comparison culture and all of that. But the pandemic probably didn't help that either. So I think there's a few things, technology, pandemic, and just, again, more broadly, that breakdown of knowing your neighbour and knowing your local community, and they're far more global generation who are more engaged online than in person. So I think all of that contributes to that loneliness and isolation. But sorry, huge tangent. Back to your question about.
This is I think it's really important because it links to how people show up at work. and that you look for community at work.
Yeah. And that's also, and again, we explore this in the Work Wellbeing book, like if that's dealt with well, that's beautiful. If it's like leveraged to be like work is a family, like we're all a family here, and you kind of that's where it gets a bit dangerous and a bit like, oh, this is in maybe going to a bad spot. But I do think younger generations are looking for more than just remuneration at work, which is why we do see them, I think, wanting to go back to the workplace more so than some of the other generations, especially the millennials who are saying, oh, we love the flexibility that remote work options provide. But if we zoom out, we looked at some research even just about the benefits and the challenges of remote working. The biggest benefit is the flexibility and the time savings. The biggest challenge is social isolation. And so I do think if people are fully remote, you just have to be more intentional then about where you get your community if you don't have this inbuilt like place of connection to go to a physical workplace where you get the work done, but then you have banter and you have fun and you go for lunch together, or all those like social aspects of work as well that not that we undervalue, because there are so many benefits to remote work and a lot of people want it. The other thing I'll say as well about Gen Z is even though it didn't rank as super high on that kind of motivation research, I've spoken to so many in the research and even in the people in my life who were saying to me, oh yeah, like I've worked for a company, I started working there in 2021 and we've never gone back to the office full time. And so it's so interesting because it's like for them, like we remember a time when it was
Monday
the
to
norm.
Friday.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so even just this, sometimes what I'll say is for older generations, work from home is a privilege, but for younger generations, it's an expectation.
Huh.
So it's like the baseline. So I think that's really interesting to, again, evaluate and look at, okay, well, what are people's expectation? Even where you might go, why is it not featuring as high on that research? Maybe because it's just an inbuilt expectation.
That's so interesting, actually. As you've just said that, I'm like, because if you started your career in COVID, if you're a grad and that's the beginning, and you're like, oh no, this is just how it is.
Just the new
Whereas
normal.
for us, we're like, remember that time we would go to the office? We were there from like 7:30 till 6. We would commute. It would be like a huge ordeal every day, and you're just normal. We know nothing different. And now, so I still see, oh my goodness, I'm just having a little mind blown moment. But I'm like, yeah, that is a privilege. And then I see this tension point because like millennial managers who are like, and Gen X managers who are like, hey, don't you get how good this is? But I've never experienced anything else.
Yeah. And that's how, and then I think the big thing with anything to do with generations is appreciating the context that each generation has had. And it's almost that like, why are you the way you are?
Yes,
kind of
the Steve
Carell from The Office.
Why are you the way that you are? We need
to
to bring that like image up, but it's such a good one.
It's so good. And I think the generational piece is really helpful, but also appreciating the context. And we have this saying, we say the age at which we're exposed to a new technology or transformative event determines how embedded it becomes in your psyche and in your lifestyle. And so for a generation exposed to the pandemic in their formative years or when they're emerging in their careers, if we look at it from a workplace perspective, that makes so much sense then that that's just kind of going to characterize their whole working life and their whole attitude to work. Whereas for us, we were raised in a very different one where you had to be seen by the boss. You wouldn't leave before the boss, all those kinds of things. And then each generation's had their own iteration of that. And so I think going, oh, okay, so that's why you are pushing back on this. That's why you're questioning every decision I make. That's why you really need, purpose as a key motivator, like just understanding the context at least then goes, okay, I'm less judgmental now and more appreciative of, what's behind the action or the decision or the tension that actually comes about in a workplace.
That's really good. Understanding those key contexts and like I think, those big, like it could be a crisis situation, economic situation. Like I think about the way Gen Xers will talk about the GFC and knowing at that moment where they were, like I think in the GFC I was finishing school. So like it's not imprinted on my mind, but when you've had people who are in financial services, they would recall so distinctly where they were when certain moments happened.
Absolutely.
And it's imprinted on, I like how you said it's imprinted on their psyche.
Yeah. It's like a reference point and it kind of dictates a lot of behaviour and attitudes and every generation's got it. And like from those world events and financial events and key technologies, like they really do shape our collective psyche, which is also just interesting in terms of when you speak to someone who's a similar age, like, remember that? They're like, yeah. And it's like a point of connection.
Yeah. And I think about the sounds for generations. Like I often think like, what are the soundtracks of a generation? For example, like the dial-up tone of the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Like I think about also imagine, I often want to be like to like a Gen Z or even to like my kids who are like, I'd be like, we used to have to sit in front of, like the laptop would be in the computer, would be in a public spot in the house and you'd hear the dun, 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 whatever that noise was. And like you could read whatever anyone was doing. There's no privacy.
Yeah.
And like MySpace and all those things that are so characteristic of a millennial versus then I'm like, what is the sound of like a Gen Z? Like I kind of think about the Netflix sound.
Yeah.
Like
Netflix sound.
What is, and like, I don't know what it would be for Gen Xers.
We need a Gen X to
We need
weigh
a Gen
in.
X to tell us. Someone tell us in the comments. But like, what is the sound of that generation? Like maybe it is the answering machine message tone.
Yes.
Remember how people did that? I mean,
Yes.
we obviously still remember that. But anyway, the fax machine.
Totally. And it's funny that you say that. I talk about that in the presentations that I deliver, and I have a slide which talks about like outgoing things for our life, but especially emerging generations. And I'll often say, you know, a young person today will never use a fax machine. They'll never use a landline phone. They'll never use a GPS system. And then I'll tell a little joke about the GPS where it's this child who's in a car with their parent, their mum, and they say, Mum, you were alive before phones, right? And the mum says, oh, yep, why? And the child says, oh, I was just wondering, how did you know where to go before Apple Maps and Google Maps? And the mother said, well, if you can believe it, we had books that lived in the car called street directories full of maps with coordinates, and you'd have to get it out and to navigate to your destination. And the child thought about that and they said, like a pirate? With the child, they're like, what are you talking about? Like a map with coordinates, like archaic. But like we remember that era.
And
like
it is like a pirate treasure map because like you would get it wrong so many times. You'd be like, where the heck are we?
Yeah, and you'd be like, oh, who's doing the directions?
Also, it
like,
would be such rage moments in the car.
Yeah.
Like just if you got, I mean, I don't know my left from right.
yeah, right. That makes you were not the navigator
I
in the car.
I don't know what happened. My parents didn't teach me, and I instead of taking any personal ownership, just blame them. But like, I don't know how they travelled through life.
Right.
Like, how did they get through life just on a day-to-day basis? But here we are, maps. I love that. A pirate with a treasure map.
Yeah, and it's just worlds away from what we have now and access to, and even with the fax machine, like. Sometimes I'll be at conferences and the new thing everyone talks about, of course, is artificial intelligence. That's the next kind of huge transformational technology that we're all trying to learn how to leverage and use well. And I'll sometimes say, I wonder if a few decades ago there was a keynote speaker up here like I am going, don't worry, the fax machine won't take your job. Like, is it that whole, like we've been here before, and maybe it's oversimplistic to compare the fax machine to artificial intelligence, but it's that idea of, each generation has had those new technologies that have shaped then their expectation of work or how they'll engage with colleagues or communicate. And so again, when you compare that and you appreciate that, you go, oh, okay, that's maybe why we're having a bit of tension or difference in the workplace as to how we're going to work together.
I love this. I think one of the big things that I've written down that is super important that you've said is how do you understand the key context that shapes a generation? Mm-hmm. And instead of being like, well, they just don't get it, how do I understand what motivates and drives that particular generation that's different to me, and seeking to understand rather than making judgment or like passing judgment? Yeah. What are some of the other motivations you're seeing? Oh, sorry. Let's get into communication styles.
Yes.
Because the communication styles are really different. And actually, I was laughing with a friend of mine around just like, even just things like email communication and just the formality from a Gen X to a millennial to a Gen Z.
Yep.
And like, Gen Z will be really informal and colloquial in the way they maybe email or chat on Teams or Slack or whatever. And then millennials somewhere in the middle. But like even things like kind regards. Do we say kind regards? I'm like, no, we don't. We say thanks. Like we say thanks heaps. I don't say kind regards. But like the formality in how we communicate. So what has your research shown about the difference in communication styles based on generations and how that kind of, I was going to say mixes up in the workplace?
Yes, I mean, there's so much to unpack. I mean, even just like the use of slang and words, and every generation has had their own slang, and Gen Z have definitely got their own, and even just the misinterpretation of like what words mean these days. Like when you're speaking to another person of your own generation, you're like, oh yeah, I know what that means, but when you're conversing with someone else, they're like, am I offended? Like if a Gen Z says slay to a baby boomer, they're like, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Like, how does that work? So even just in terms of the language we use, I think that's an interesting piece of difference. But in terms of in the workplace communication, from the research that I've seen, it's actually really interesting. Every generation said their number one way they'd like to would prefer to communicate with their colleagues is face-to-face interaction. But it was a much higher proportion of baby boomers than Gen Z who said that. So ways that you can look at, I guess, information and research is to look at, okay, what's the ordering like in this, table, but then what's the percentage? So it could be like 90% of baby boomers compared to 50% of Gen Z, even though it's still number one for every generation. Okay. So as you would expect, older generations like much more appreciative of face-to-face interaction and relationships. And then as we looked down the list, there was a bit of difference there. It was funny, as you mentioned, MySpace. It was like direct messaging came up quite high for millennials. And I'm like, that's because of MySpace for sure.
Yes.
Like an MSN, Messenger.
MSN. Oh.
Speaking to your crush like after school, like BRB, got to go to dinner.
And also the acronyms that we used to do because of the way we would text. Remember before we had iPhones and you had to text and you had to press through 3 buttons to get to the actual letter you were trying to.
Exactly.
Sorry, that's an aside. Keep going. So millennials wanted DMs. They're happy with that.
Yeah. Whereas I think for the other generations, there was very much kind of email came up kind of before then, and then phone calls as well. So I think there's definitely some nuances there, but I guess the main ones come through in the workplace, in the research, in terms of how we expect to communicate. But then, yeah, like you said, there is nuance even within those places of communication. The other one, the stereotype I hear a lot is, maybe this is more for millennials than even Gen Z, like don't call me out of the blue. I need a text first. Oh, have you heard that?
Yeah.
But I kind of relate, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think phone calls I'm not a caller.
Me neither.
But I know Gen Z would say they're not callers either. They don't like calls.
No.
Is that what the research shows too?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a bit more of that, like, just give me a heads up first. Like, can't we just chat this through online rather than having to give the energy to, get on a call?
It's funny because, like, I also don't like back and forward, like, email duels.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, we could have just picked up the phone. So, but I do think it's about the heads up, right? Like, and no one wants a heads up like, Ash, we need to talk.
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying. It's like, hey, Ash, can we chat about this when works?
Yeah.
And then at least cool, I'm going to have a phone call about this thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to lose my job today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is definitely, what's in the heads up. It makes a big difference.
In the heads up.
Yeah, rather than just ambiguity.
So when you think about are there points of friction when it comes to communication that you see between different generations at work?
Yeah, I mean, there is for sure in terms of even just the in meetings and how people will communicate. I feel like with Gen Z, again, if we look at the context that shaped them, and us younger millennials as well.
Well, I think you are. I don't think I would be. I'm smack bam in the middle. You're on the cusp, as we said.
I'm on the cusp. Yeah, that's right. Just clinging on to my youth. Like,
I like that you're going to. I like that you're saying to your Gen Z team members, like, "Hey, I'm also I'm with you. Like, I'm right here." And they're looking at you like, "No, you're not."
There's like the judgment is so real. I'm like, be so for real. They're like, "Don't use that language with us." I'm like, oh, okay,
I don't
no
even
worries.
know what that is.
Yeah,
and
okay.
also the funny thing about language is it dates so fast.
It does.
So if you say it late,
fast.
not good.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Anyway, sorry.
It's
actually,
dangerous.
I want to talk to you about one thing. I'm writing it down on my list. We'll come to that. So
Okay. So yes, there is definitely nuances there with communication. And I think for younger generations, just being aware, again, for the context, that they have been shaped in an era of information overload, message saturation. I think for older generations, we're used to when we got when older generations, got a paper and that was their news. Whereas like by the time a Generation Z walks into the workplace, they're caught up on global news. They've watched 800 TikTok videos, like they've been doom scrolling on the train or whatever it might be on the metro. Like it's such a different kind of space. And so I think even then their expectation, or each generation's expectation of how you will communicate a message, is also different, which I can understand for a leader. It's terrifying to hear that. You're like, do I have to tailor the same message for every single generation? Like that's a lot of work. And that's not what I'm suggesting or recommending. But I do think just an appreciation of, again, the differences and just an awareness of that can help, where you go, okay, maybe that doesn't need to be a company-wide email, maybe that doesn't need to be this, or maybe I'll tighten up XYZ here because maybe I can share a video about that and send it out. Maybe that'll get traction. Just being a bit more kind of open to that. The other thing sometimes we'll talk about is, even with like the rise of video content, and just this is beyond a workplace, this is just in general, that the number one search engine is no longer Google, it's YouTube, because why would you read something when you can watch a video about it? Now you've got TikTok and AI kind of new search engines coming in, and again, changing up our expectation of how we receive information and communication. I think that is translating as well to a workplace, maybe more so in a consumer setting. But I think from an employee perspective, how leaders can communicate, can get a bit more creative with their stuff, maybe ease back on the formal language for younger generations. Again, not saying, go and pepper it with slang. But actually, I heard a funny story. We were talking about the year that's been, and we're talking about the summer I turned pretty, like that era and that craze. Yes. And then I was talking to another friend outside of work, and she was saying that her employer, like only a couple of weeks ago, had sent like a company-wide email and like made a reference to Summer I Turned Pretty. And she's like, that was such a good effort, but that thing was like 6 months ago, like that craze. and like it was just the tone. Like, it was like, we appreciate you trying so much, but like it just kind of missed the mark a little bit. But I also think, look, the person was trying to kind of connect and to be relevant. And so there's always that line of, I think every generation who's younger is going to think the older ones are cringe. Like it's just a rite of passage,
it is a rite of passage.
So, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting even hearing you when you say you don't have to tailor your communication. If you're a leader, you don't have to tailor your communication to every generation, but you should be aware of their styles and preferences. I don't know, because I'm kind of like thinking about that, and we both like speak a lot for our work, and a good communicator does tailor their message for the person they're trying to get to understand it. And so I'm thinking about this as, okay, well, what could you do that isn't going to create a huge amount of mental and time pressure? And I'm just thinking like, I'm going to sneeze in a sec, so just bear with me. Oh, gosh. Okay, sorry.
Bless you.
I'm just thinking about this, and there's that whole concept of before someone really understands a message, they have to hear it 7 times or however many times, but it's not once.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, well, if I'm a manager and I have on my team boomers, Gen Xers and Gen Zs and millennials, well, what can I do? Well, just try a couple of different modes of communication, not just the one singular.
Yeah.
And it could be, hey, I've got an email. If I'm updating people on a change management thing we're doing, I'm going to email out, this is what's happening. I'm going to do a 1-minute video and I'm going to get people together in a team meeting.
Yeah.
And I've got 3 modes, and I'm going to communicate multiple times across different mediums. Like I don't think that's putting us through too many hurdles, but it's also recognizing that if your message needs to be heard, you've got to communicate it in a way that can be received by different people with different preferences.
Yeah.
And I know people listening are probably like potentially eye-rolling, being like, well, that's too much work. And it's like, no, I don't know. I think that is just good communication, meeting your audience, meeting your people where they're at.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like I just think as well about this idea of how do we help people to understand, and helping people understand is knowing what works for them, the way that they receive information and tailoring it. So
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are as you're hearing that, or what even you would recommend based on what you're seeing.
I think I love that. And maybe not every piece of, every message needs that approach. But yeah, when it is something that is really important and you really want people to hear what you're saying and get the message and be clear, I totally agree. I'm always a bit like, every generation needs their own approach. And then leaders are like, oh my gosh, one message now with 5 generations in the workplace, that's just going to be 5 times the work. But yeah, you'll get a better result. You'll get a better response if it is more personalized to every generation. I mean, people are probably sick of hearing we're in an era of personalization, but we are. From everything we consume, as consumers of Netflix and Spotify and algorithms, we are used to things being really customized and tailored to our own interests. And that probably goes from a generational perspective as well. And I think the brands, from a consumer perspective, but also just in terms of the workplace, those leaders who do get that traction and that trust, they are taking that personalized approach. I think the other thing that's really helpful to keep in mind with this is I have been involved in authoring reports about this, and I did a big one called Generations Defined, and I was like, how do I land this whole report in terms of just speaking about generational differences the whole time? And I had 3 things. I said, understand what differentiates generations, understand what makes us the same, and then lead with empathy. That was the 3 kind of takeaways. Because I think as much as there is so much gold and relevance in understanding each generation, at the end of the day, we are still all human beings. And there is that element of there's so much that changes, but there are some things that don't change and that are timeless. And in terms of communication, one thing I found that works really well that every generation responds to is humour.
Yes.
And that kind of those timeless elements where you're like, we all want to relax and laugh and connect to something, and humour is a way that you can do that. Now, again, if we get really granular, every generation might have a different sense of humour or might find different things funny. But I guess doing those activities and going, okay, well, what are those timeless elements that don't change, using that as a starter, and then maybe tweaking, the delivery or the mode to accommodate each generation or a few different generations, I think is a worthwhile endeavour, because you will get better cut through if you do it that way.
It's really, all of this I think is so helpful. I love that. So understanding the differences, understanding what makes them the same, and leading with empathy, I think is so, so helpful to kind of frame up how do we navigate all the differences that we see. We're going to go to a quick break, and when we come back, I've got 2 final questions for you.
Do you want to grow in your career? Are you after a fresh start or some inspiration? Or perhaps you're in a career crisis? The book Sort Your Career Out and Make More Money by Shelley Johnson and Glenn James is such a great resource at any stage in your career. It will give you practical strategies for things like getting a promotion, making more money, moving into a leadership role, taking career risks, or if it's time to quit your job, and so much more. You can find Sort Your Career Out and Make More Money wherever good books are sold, or via the link in the podcast show notes. It's also available as an audiobook.
You posted on LinkedIn at the end of 2025 about the word of the year. Can you tell us what it was and unpack it for us? Because I had a little laugh as I read it.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting exercise to look at the word of the year, because it kind of summarises the year that has been. In 2024, it was kind of doom scroll and brain rot. And this year it was rage bait. So really interesting choice. It beat out a few other words like parasocial, it beat out 6-7, it beat out AI slop. And it was really interesting to think about, why that is and what's going on. So basically rage bait is a strategic way of crafting content or communicating a message, particularly, I guess, leaning towards social media, that elicits rage in the viewer or the consumer to then cause you to stop scrolling and actually engage with the content. So it's an interesting turn of events, I think, with regards to social media. If anyone's feeling a bit anxious or overwhelmed by the content you're seeing online and that it's just trying to cause this stir up of emotions, it's kind of this new era of clickbait, but it's just a more aggressive form of that. So that's the word of the year, which I was quite surprised by. But
who comes up with the word of the year?
all the different dictionaries. So the Oxford English Dictionary, Collins Dictionary, Macquarie, they all kind of put their words forward and they track like particularly new terms that kind of come into the zeitgeist. And that's why 6-7 got – we were talking about this the other day, me and some friends. They were like, how did 6-7 make it? And we're like, it's just so prolific. Like it's just this huge meme that every young person knows and now teachers and parents all know it. And like it's crazy that in a McDonald's, they'll call out order 6-7 and everyone cheers. Like it's just that prolific. So that's how these words kind of get evaluated and their impact on society and our lives.
I mean, yeah, there was a lot of rage bait. I got so into like thinking about, what is it that's like capturing people here? But I'm kind of sad that AI slop didn't make it because I feel like I've seen more AI slop than rage bait, to be honest.
Especially, in our, I guess, sphere in online where it's like, you can, the it's written content and the telltale signs, the M dash and all those things where it's like, a chat has been here.
I can't stand it. It's the one that really characterises it for me, Ash, is when it goes, it's not this, it's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm like, stop it with your dumb contrast. Like, it's so obvious. Like, it's not 6, it's 7. Like, I don't know. Like, it has this thing to it. It's always the juxtaposition of two ideas that are so basic. And I'm like, I just cannot. I have no time for any, and because I love words. I love written content. I don't like video content anywhere near as much. And so I'm like, these words annoy me so much. Yeah. Anyway, that's an aside. Rage bait is happening.
Rage bait. The AI slop is rage baiting you.
It's like I get so annoyed. Anyway.
That's so fair.
Yeah, that flowed really well. But interesting. Hey, I've got one final question for you on this because it's really, we could go so many places with this. You said this really interesting thing. So the motivators for generations are different. You said Gen Z, career progression, millennials, flexibility, Gen Xers is the dollars, like remuneration, I should say, sounds better. Gen X is just all about the dollars, which makes sense. So again, going back to what you said about life stage where you're heading towards retirement, of course, remuneration is going to be most important.
Yeah.
And then boomers, location. But then you said this really amazing thing around they had all different motivators at work, but they all had the same trait they were after in a workplace, which was trust.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as you said that, oh my goodness, like what does that speak to us about not just organizations, corporates, but also the way we consume information. This is vibe. I'm not a researcher like you. I don't know and this is a vibe only. But I guess my sense is the reason that is so important to us because we have such low trust in corporations, low trust in the media, and so we're seeking this out because we see so much evidence of a lack of trust.
Yeah, for sure. Like declining trust for the last few years has been really low in the big corporations. In the media, it's really low as well. In like tech companies, like there is just the erosion of trust. The place that Aussies have the most trust is in small businesses, which I think is really interesting, followed by charities. And so a shout out to all the small business owners out there who are like
slogging their guts out.
Exactly.
Love you.
Exactly. But I think trust is definitely that premium that if you can build it and grow it and maintain it, whether it's with your customers or with your employees or with your direct reports, like it's just it excels so many of these other trends, and I think it transcends generations and it transcends the differences, and it's that whole this is what is like as humans we want to trust other people, we want to trust our leaders, we want to trust the organisation that we are giving our time, money and effort to, that we're coming into the office for, even though we might want flexibility. Like that trust is so important, and if you can build it and if you can maintain it, it is really key. And again, like you said, in an era of AI slop, like we're all questioning what is real and what is not, what is written by a bot and what is actually written by a person. The other thing that we've definitely seen as well is a personality premium, the idea that behind the big corporations we want to see the people. And even just interestingly, like even when I look at, organizations and brands compared to individuals, like there is definitely, like we want to connect to the actual person. And that, again, it speaks to, I think, for younger generations, that desire for authenticity. And I know that word has been like very popularized over the last few years, but it's like we want to know, I think even more so today with the rise of AI, like what is actually true and what is real and what can I connect to? Because it feels, it can be a quick way to erode trust if you position something as written by a human, but it's actually not. And it's really hard to discern sometimes. And sometimes it's really easy because it is AI slop. But yeah, it's a lot.
And it's going to become harder to discern the difference. And I think people are hypersensitive to that, right? So like we know as AI gets better and better, and it's like that is happening so fast that we are going to have less chance of identifying, is this real or not? And so I feel that there is this desire for people to meet in person, to connect in real life. And I think what you said about like trust being a premium, like I almost see that as I wrote down, like actually as if you're an organization, if you're a leader, it's such a competitive advantage if you can actually go, we are a high trust organization, because there are so few organizations who could probably hang their hat on that.
Yeah.
And I think certainly we had a podcast at the end with Matt McFarlane, who is in the startup space, particularly with tech, and he said it was really interesting. He talked about back probably 10 years ago, everyone wanted to work in tech, like for the Googles of this world, because of the way they'd done their employer brand, like so super strong, like very sexy from all angles. But then now the trust that people have in those brands because of, I guess, like redundancies, restructures, all that stuff. It's really interesting hearing you say small business. Like I find that amazing to hear you say that. And then also I wonder as well, like political trust is obviously super low. So all these things contribute to, if every generation wants trust, as a leader, if you're listening, if you manage people, you have such a huge impact over that ability to create trust. Like I would say the single biggest impact on how you build organizational trust is leaders living out consistently the values of that organization.
Yeah, for sure. And we spoke a lot about those different motivators, and for Gen Z it was career and flexibility, for millennials and then remuneration and location. The other thing that I will talk about if I'm sharing these insights, I'd put up the table and you can see the ordering of each generation. The only one that's in the top 5 is accessible and approachable leadership. So it's so important, I think, like leadership. And it shows again, like every generation is different, but the thread through them all is we all want to work for leaders that we trust and that we believe in and that believe in us, and that we can be, vulnerable about actually how we are going at work and what is really going on even outside of work and all of that. So if you can remember that as well, like to tailor the approach to the generations, but then remember what is the commonality piece, and that trust and the way we lead is just so monumental and impacts everything else in a workplace for sure.
It's a really good way to end, because we can listen to this stuff and we can feel overwhelmed, or we can feel like, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't understand about different generations. A couple of key actions that I think people can take. The first is you can jump on and follow Ashley Fell on LinkedIn. Action number 1, we'll put her in the show notes, her link. But 2 things you can do. Number 1 is just seek out different perspectives, like get curious about I love what you said about the key context. You could even go, hey, what are some of the defining moments that you would say for a Gen Z define your generation? They'll tell you. And we could tell ours. Like I know it's cliche, but I remember like, how they say everyone remembers where they were when 9/11 happened? Like those key moments in your psyche that actually shape a generation. Like you could probably have maybe 3 for each generation you could draw on, but asking the questions of how that's shaped you as a person, be it in like really profound ways, but also kind of micro ways. The other thing I think is going back to, what's the areas that we have similarities in, which is obviously trust. And so how do we build trust in leadership as leaders, and how do we be accessible and approachable? Ash, thank you so much for hanging out. People are going to want to connect with you, so LinkedIn the best way to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, amazing. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to do 2 things. Share it with a friend give us a 5-star rating on Spotify because, sometimes I'm a bit needy about feedback, It's just being raw and real with you all. Anyway, Spotify or Apple, love it. Thanks for hanging out.
If you have enjoyed the show today, forward it to a friend, colleague, or family member who you may think it would benefit. Shelley's business Boldside provides leadership training for a variety of different businesses. To learn more, visit boldside.com.au. If you would like to book Shelley to speak at one of your events, please reach out to the team via moneypodcast.com.au.